At 7:30 in the morning Washington time, U.S. Central Command completed a 90-minute wave of strikes against a tiny, obscure piece of land most people have never heard of, Greater Tunb Island, sitting right at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz. And CENTCOM's own statement, posted directly on X, described exactly what got hit. Precision munitions against coastal defense systems and cruise missile storage and launch sites. And CENTCOM added that the strikes further degraded Iran's ability to attack commercial shipping through the strait. And here's why that one small island actually matters so much, because Greater Tunb isn't a normal military base with runways and barracks you can see from a satellite photo and immediately understand. It's exactly the kind of place this title is describing, a coastal hideout, a spot where Iran has been quietly storing and staging the exact weapons it needs to threaten tankers and warships without ever having to expose that hardware. And one of its bigger, more obvious coastal installations. And here's the thing that makes this story genuinely insane. Once you see the full scope of it, this wasn't a one-off strike. It was the latest entry in a nightly campaign that CENTCOM has been running against Iran's coastline for weeks on end. So let's walk through this entire campaign against Iran's coastal hideouts, night by night, straight from CENTCOM's own confirmed public releases. Because once you see how relentless and how targeted this has actually been, you'll understand exactly why the word insane fits. So let's start with the geography, because it matters. This is a small, sparsely populated island sitting right near the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, one of 3 disputed islands in that stretch of water alongside Lesser Tunb and Abu Musa. Islands that have actually been the subject of a decades-long territorial dispute between Iran and the United Arab Emirates. And precisely because these islands are small, remote, and not the kind of place that draws routine international attention, they make an ideal location to quietly stockpile cruise missiles and coastal defense systems without the same level of scrutiny a mainland base near a major city would attract. And that's exactly the profile. CENTCOM's own strike statement fits: precision munitions against coastal defense systems and crews, missile storage and launch sites hidden in plain sight on an island most people couldn't find on a map before this week. Now, let's go back and actually build out the nightly campaign that led to this point, because this is where the story becomes genuinely staggering. On July 8th, CENTCOM posted that at the direction of the commander-in-chief, forces had started conducting additional strikes against Iran to further degrade its ability to threaten freedom of navigation in the strait, explicitly framing the action as holding Iran accountable for what CENTCOM called unjustified aggression against commercial shipping and civilian crews. 3 days later, on July 11th, CENTCOM completed a 3rd round of strikes that same week, this time explicitly described as holding Iranian forces accountable for attacking another commercial ship in the Strait of Hormuz. And the very next day, July 12th, CENTCOM completed yet another new wave, hitting dozens of targets at multiple locations with precision munitions, specifically to degrade Iran's ability to continue attacking international shipping. And that same week, according to The Hill's own reporting citing CENTCOM directly, American forces hit roughly 170 targets across 2 rounds of strikes on a Tuesday and Wednesday, and roughly 140 additional Iranian military targets on the following Saturday, with CENTCOM specifying the target categories explicitly: missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage facilities, communication networks, and coastal surveillance locations. And on July 15th, CENTCOM posted that a second wave of strikes that single day was underway, again targeting Iranian military capabilities used to threaten vessels transiting the strait. And then, on a Sunday shortly after, CENTCOM struck Iranian air defense systems, coastal radar sites, missile and drone capabilities, and small boats, using fighter aircraft, naval vessels, one-way attack aerial drones, and for the first time in this specific campaign, one-way attack sea drones. And CENTCOM stated plainly on X that the commander-in-chief had directed the strikes specifically to hold Iranian forces accountable. And this pattern just kept going. On July 19th, CENTCOM conducted another wave marking the 9th consecutive night of strikes, with ABC News confirming CENTCOM's own language that the strikes targeted Iranian military command centers, air defense and coastal surveillance sites, maritime capabilities, missile and drone launch sites, and communications networks in a direct effort to weaken Iran's control over the strait. And that same day carried a real human cost on the American side, too. A U.S. service member was killed and another wounded during what CENTCOM called a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian projectile, which is a sober reminder that even the cleanup after these strikes and interceptions carries genuine risk for the people carrying it out. And by July 22nd at 10:30 p.m. Eastern, CENTCOM completed another round of strikes marking the 12th consecutive night of this campaign, and Jerusalem Post, reporting from around this same window, captured just how methodical and sustained this had become, describing a fresh round of strikes ahead of the U.S. formally reinstating its naval blockade on Iran. with a U.S. official telling the Post directly, quote, "No ship will leave and no ship will enter," and that same report described a 7-hour operation involving U.S. aircraft, drones, and naval vessels, hitting missile and drone sites, naval assets, and coastal defenses, specifically to reduce Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping, with Iranian state media separately confirming air defenses had been activated around the Bushehr nuclear power plant and reporting explosions on Kish Island and Keshem Island in response. Now, here's where the campaign we already covered in an earlier breakdown picks up directly from this exact timeline. Because by July 28th and 29th, this had escalated into the surprise ballistic missile attack on the American base in Jordan and the targeting of CENTCOM's own regional headquarters. And by July 30th, CENTCOM had completed what it called a heavy wave of new attacks following a 5-night pause, striking dozens of IRGC targets, including military command centers, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance and defense sites, and maritime capabilities, with Iranian media reporting a couple and their 2-year-old child killed when a residential building was struck on Keshem Island, and bombing separately reported in Avaz and Abadan. And it's worth being honest here, that's a real reported civilian toll from Iranian state media following one of these strikes. And while it hasn't been independently verified by outside investigators the way the military target list has, a claim like that from an official Iranian news source deserves to be acknowledged rather than omitted. And this is exactly the kind of dense, overlapping strike record that the August 10th Greater Tunb Island operation extends directly, night after night, wave after wave. For more than a month straight, CENTCOM has been working through Iran's coastline, hitting radar installations, missile storage depots, small boat fleets, and communications networks, in what amounts to one of the most sustained coastal degradation campaigns of this entire war. Now, let's zoom out and connect this directly to the broader naval blockade, because these coastal strikes and the blockade are two halves of the exact same strategy. Wikipedia's own detailed tracking of the blockade confirms it was imposed on April 13th, 2026, following the failure of the Islamabad talks to end the war under the direction of President Trump and the command of Admiral Brad Cooper at CENTCOM, and it was explicitly designed to encompass the entirety of the Iranian coastline, with CENTCOM warning that any vessel entering or departing the blockaded area without authorization would face consequences. And the blockade's own confirmed tally, 3 ships seized outright, 85 vessels intercepted according to CENTCOM, 26 vessels that managed to bypass it according to the shipping industry's own independent tracker Lloyd's List, and a cost to Iran estimated at $500 million a day. All of that only works as a strategy if the coastal infrastructure supporting Iran's ability to resist or evade that blockade, the radar sites that would spot approaching American vessels, the missile storage that could threaten ships trying to enforce it, the small boat fleets that could try to slip past it, keeps getting degraded in parallel, which is exactly what this entire nightly strike campaign has been doing. So the blockade closes the front door, and these coastal hideout strikes are what's been closing every side door and hidden passage along the coastline at the same time. And it's worth explaining exactly what that one-way attack sea drone detail actually means, because the Hill's own reporting flagged it specifically as a first for this campaign. CENTCOM's statement noted forces used one-way attack aerial drones and, for the first time, one-way attack sea drones, alongside fighter aircraft and naval vessels, and that's a genuinely significant escalation in the toolkit being used against these coastal targets, because a one-way attack sea drone is essentially an uncrewed surface vessel packed with explosives and sent directly at a target, detonating on impact rather than returning to base, which means American forces introduced an entirely new category of weapon into this coastal campaign, specifically suited to hitting exactly the kind of small boats, coastal radar installations, and nearshore infrastructure that this whole strategy has been built around, and the fact that this new capability debuted specifically during a strike explicitly targeting air defense systems, coastal radar sites, missile and drone capabilities, and small boats tells you the American approach to Iran's coastal hideouts has been evolving in real time, not just repeating the same tactics. Wave after wave. Now, let's go back even further, because this coastal strategy didn't start in July. It goes all the way back to the opening days of this war on February 28th, when Operation Epic Fury began. And by March 10th, just 10 days into that campaign, U.S. Central Command's own released figures showed the United States had already struck more than 5,000 targets across Iran, while 50 Iranian vessels had been damaged or destroyed. And CENTCOM stated the operation was specifically tasked with striking sites linked to Iran's security apparatus, locations posing what it called an imminent threat, and a huge share of that early campaign was aimed directly at coastal military infrastructure, the naval bases at Bandar Abbas, Konarak, and Bandar Anzali, the exact ports where Iran's surface fleet, its frigates, its catamarans, its drone carrier had been sitting, And by the time that opening phase wrapped, CENTCOM's own later congressional testimony put the total naval toll at 161 vessels, destroyed, and 90% of Iran's roughly 8,000 sea mines eliminated. So the coastal hideouts campaign we've just walked through, night after night through July and now into August, isn't a new strategy. It's the continuation of exactly what started on day one of this war, methodically working through Iran's coastline, port by port, storage, site by storage site, and hitting whatever's dispersed and hidden there before it can be used. And it's worth noting the pattern of how this whole thing keeps restarting, because Axios reported that Trump had actually paused strikes on Iran back on a Friday after 13 consecutive nights of attacks on Iranian military targets, opening what was meant to be a real window for diplomacy following those Islamabad talks breaking down. And Iran's own missile attack on American forces shattered that pause, with Trump resuming the full military campaign 5 days later, and that resumption is exactly what produced the dense run of strikes we just walked through in detail. So the Coastal Hideouts campaign doesn't run on a fixed schedule. It surges specifically every time a ceasefire or diplomatic pause breaks down, which is exactly the dynamic behind both the July wave and this most recent Greater Tunb Island operation. Now, it's also worth going back to that International Crisis Group documentation one more time, because it captures the two-sided nature of this exchange precisely. CENTCOM reported striking Iranian air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and more than 60 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps small boats in and near the strait in one specific round alone, and the IRGC announced in response that it had retaliated with strikes against, in its own words, 85 locations of important U.S. military facilities in Bahrain and Kuwait. So for every wave of American strikes working through Iran's coastal hideouts, there's been a corresponding wave of Iranian retaliation, aimed back at American and allied positions elsewhere in the region, which is exactly the kind of tit-for-tat escalation that's defined this entire summer. And it's worth pausing on one particular detail from that July 22nd wave, because it shows just how far this coastal campaign has been willing to reach. Iranian state media reported that a U.S. projectile had reportedly exploded near a water and electricity facility on Kish Island, a popular tourist destination that also happens to sit directly in the strait's approach. And separately, additional explosions were heard on Keshem Island, according to the IRGC-linked FARS news agency, with the cause not immediately confirmed. And around that same window, air defenses around the Bushehr nuclear power plant were activated. And while CENTCOM's own target lists throughout this campaign have consistently emphasized missile sites, radar installations, and naval capabilities rather than nuclear infrastructure itself, the simple fact that air defenses at a nuclear facility were being activated in response to strikes happening elsewhere along that same coastline tells you how on edge the entire southern Iranian coast has been during this stretch. Every island, every port town, every piece of infrastructure sitting close enough to the strait to be relevant to shipping has effectively become part of the same contested strip of territory. Now, let's talk about why hitting these dispersed coastal sites actually matters more than it might seem at first glance. Because CENTCOM's own stated objective across every single one of these operations has been consistent, degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz specifically. And that strait carries roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and natural gas supply through a channel barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, which means every single cruise missile storage site destroyed, every coastal radar site taken out, every small boat sunk in these operations is directly tied to whether tankers can move safely through one of the most economically important waterways on the planet, and the strikes on Kish Island's water and electricity infrastructure, the explosions on Keshem Island, the activated air defenses around the Bushehr nuclear plant. All of that tells you this campaign has been running across a genuinely wide stretch of Iran's entire southern coast, not concentrated on one single spot. Now, here's a detail that actually deepens the coastal hideout angle even further, and it comes from Iran's own side of this conflict. Back on March 28th, Iran's Fars news agency, through a spokesperson for the country's central headquarters, claimed that Iranian forces had targeted 2 U.S. Army, quote, hideouts in Dubai, alleging that American personnel had relocated to those specific sites after earlier Iranian strikes on more conventional bases in the region, with more than 500 troops supposedly split between the two locations. And U.S. authorities never confirmed that claim. And I want to be clear that I'm including it here specifically because of what it reveals about the broader shape of this war, not because it's independently verified. Because if Iran genuinely believed American forces were dispersing into hidden, unconventional sites to avoid being targeted at their normal bases, that tells you both sides in this conflict have been playing the exact same game, moving assets away from obvious, easily identified installations and into quieter, less conspicuous locations, specifically to avoid becoming the next headline strike. And Greater Tunb Island fits that exact pattern from Iran's side. A small, unremarkable island that most people outside the region had never heard of before CENTCOM's statement this week, quietly used to store and stage cruise missiles and coastal defense systems, specifically because it wasn't the kind of high-profile target that draws attention the way a major naval base does, at least until it did. Now, I want to give you the honest, complete picture of where this campaign actually stands, because that's what matters most. Here, the confirmed record, straight from CENTCOM's own public releases, shows a genuinely relentless, more than month-long nightly campaign against Iran's coastal military infrastructure. July 8th, July 11th, July 12th, July 15th, July 19th, July 22nd, July 28th through 30th, and now August 10th, each one hitting a specific named category of coastal target, radar sites, missile and drone storage, communications networks, small boat fleets, cruise missile launch sites, and running alongside that confirmed military record. There's a real human cost being reported from both sides. A U.S. service member killed during ordnance disposal on July the 19th, and Iranian state media reporting a family of 3 killed on Qeshm Island during the July 30th wave, plus more than 30 civilians overall, according to Iran's own government spokesperson, all of it deserving honest acknowledgement rather than being left out just because it complicates a clean narrative, and there's Iran's own retaliatory claims running throughout this same window too. Missile attacks on the base in Jordan, drone waves toward American positions across the region, and that unverified claim about hitting hidden American troop locations in Dubai. All of it forming a genuinely two-sided, still unfolding conflict along this entire coastline. Not a simple, one-directional story. So where does this go from here? Watch for whether CENTCOM identifies additional small islands or dispersed coastal sites in the coming days, because if Greater Tunb was genuinely being used to hide cruise missile stocks, there's every reason to think similar small, overlooked locations along Iran's coast, maybe even Lesser Tunb or Abu Musa, given their identical strategic position, are being used the exact same way. And watch how Iran responds to losing this specific capability, because coastal defense systems and cruise missile storage sites aimed at the Strait are a core part of how Iran has tried to threaten shipping throughout this entire war, and losing another one narrows Tehran's options even further. Right at the moment, the blockade is already costing them an estimated $500 million every single day. So make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss the next update on this, because with CENTCOM striking this coastline on what's essentially become a near nightly basis for over a month now, there's a very strong chance another one of these hidden sites gets hit before this week is even over. And I'd genuinely love to hear what you think down in the comments. Do you think Iran has more of these small, dispersed coastal hideouts still active along the coastline that haven't been found yet? Or do you think this campaign has already worked through the majority of what's actually out there? Drop your take below, because it genuinely shapes what I dig into on this channel next. And if this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening along Iran's coast instead of just catching a headline about one island getting hit, share it with somebody who's been trying to follow this war.